happens, though, when in my reading of the research, particularly about study abroad, is, and I'm quoting from Kinginger here, the study abroad research instead portrays study abroad students as engaging in more of a socialization process towards strategic cultivation of communicative incompetence. Celeste's words there. And so, I mean, what happens? The idea is that students go, they have access to all of these great cultural informants, but what actually happens on the ground there? And I'll take just a quick example, and again, Celeste has written so much about this, but I find this one example from one of her studies where we have a report from an actual study abroad student. Alice was an advanced level French student who described in her diary a conversation with a peer that turned to politics. Okay, so these are the student's words and her reporting on her experience in study abroad. She says, "I tried at least 3 times to change the topic, but each time he continued. Then he said, frankly, I don't like the United States. I took that a little personal. He didn't want to talk about other things, so I stopped talking. I wanted to cry, frankly. I don't do politics, and plus, I don't even know how to express myself. I don't know the vocabulary, and I don't care." Okay, well, this was just one study, or one case study and one student and everything, but I actually, in my spare time, attend study abroad programs as a student. I'm a learner of French. And this kind of comment looks very familiar to me and, my study abroad pals, when I'm on my study abroad programs. This is very typical of not all, but many of the American students that I see up close in their study abroad situations. The study abroad research indicates that students emerge from their years of language study lacking in critical cultural awareness and political education, that they really need to play the role of an American outside their country. And so the topic that I was looking at today is sort of starts to address this question of how are students prepared for these immersion programs. And by preparation, I mean in the language classes, the kinds of things that students are exposed to, the language that, and the situations that they're learning about in their language classes. What do students learn about political controversy from their study of foreign language before they engage in an immersive environment such as study abroad? Okay, and I've identified political controversy as one point of particular interest. The point of interest where in that one case study was something that the student was not interested in. But how are students prepared for engaging in conversation about controversy? If we define controversy in not a terribly technical way, just from Wikipedia, controversy is a state of prolonged public dispute or debate, usually concerning a matter of opinion. Perennial issues of controversy include history, religion, philosophy, and politics, and it's politics that, in particular, that I'm looking at here. So the idea is that these are topics of prolonged, they're public dispute or debate. Okay, so they go beyond the primary in Florida, just that season, but they continue for a longer period of time. The particular controversy that I looked at in a number of French textbooks was a controversial strand of events in Quebec in the 1960s and 70s. And this kind of set of events called La Révolution Tranquille, the Quiet Revolution, resulted in the French language law, and a lot of people have heard of this, is that in Quebec there's a law that signs on stores have to be in French. All the government, French is the official language of Quebec, as opposed to the rest of Canada, which has French and English. Okay, so it was events during this period that resulted in the French language law, the 1980 referendum on Quebec sovereignty, which is something that most people are probably familiar with as well. Okay, so these are arguably some pretty big, important, controversial kind of events for students studying French in North America. And what I wanted to look at was how they appeared in French textbooks. Let me just start and talk a little bit more about what the controversy, kind of the points of controversy consisted of. And there were really two. Within Quebec, in the 1960s, there was really a big change of power, where power had been held by the church, the Catholic Church, and so things like schools, hospitals, insurance, everything was kind of wrapped up in the church, and the English, or English Canadians. Who were English, and they controlled the commerce and the business. In the 60s, that kind of changed into kind of power in the hands of the Quebec government. Okay, so with that kind of change of power, there is controversy. One history book calls it a conflict between conservatism and modernism. The controversy that most people are more familiar with is the more public one that existed between the Canadian, the federal government, Canada. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada for quite some time, but the end of the 60s into the 70s. The other guy there is René Lévesque, who was ultimately the premier, like the governor of Quebec. And so there are all sorts of arguments between the two of them. I mean, René Lévesque was the leader of the independence movement, which is a good controversial kind of topic. So anyway, there are those two aspects of controversy. So the Quiet Revolution really, I think, satisfies the definition: prolonged public dispute or debate. It started prior to the 1960s, where seeds of change were planted, and it continues through today, where people you talk to, it's inherent in everything. It permeates all aspects of public life: government, schools, media, interpersonal conversation. People in Canada hold strong opinions about the issues. I think that's safe to say. Okay, so that's a controversy. What I wanted to do was to look at how this particular controversy was presented in French textbooks, and I had already a file containing the Canadian and Quebecois content in 10 beginning level French books from the 2000s. And this is there's a paper that's in Modern Language Journal that it describes the sampling of that and not looking particularly at the Quiet Revolution, but it talks about kind of what I was doing with those books. What I did here, in order to kind of go back to that data file and look for Quiet Revolution, was simply to look up some of the words, some of the key words surrounding this controversy. So I have a file of all the Canadian Quebecois content in 10 textbooks. It's about 124 pages, single-spaced, 34K words. And so I looked for these kind of words that, would index this controversy. And here you see the numbers of instances that these words actually appear. Our two main characters, René Lévesque, Pierre Trudeau, not mentioned, not at all. I searched both for the French and for the English and different forms of the words and everything. I just put it up here to be as simple as possible. So our two main characters are not in there. The word Quiet Revolution, or Révolution Tranquille, n'existe pas. I mean, there just really isn't very much. There are other things in those books, and if we look for some of the themes of the Quiet Revolution stated in other terms, there are some of those things in there. But just kind of as a first run through, this is what I was starting with. So I thought from there, okay, well, the 2000s are not the place where I'm going to find the controversy. It's not talked about explicitly anyway. And so from there, let me give you my. Those are the textbooks that were included in that original sample. So what I did next was to ask some questions about textbooks of a different era. Would texts published closer to the time period include explicit references to the Quiet Revolution and the related controversy? And if so, how is the controversy presented? Okay, what's the language that the students actually see talking about this controversy? And particularly, are there dialogues showing interlocutors discussing the controversy? So you see, again, the genre of conversation. Do you see examples of that where people are actually talking about controversy? And then do students see Americans engaging in any dialogue concerning the controversy? can they see examples of like themselves, of what they might be able to say in a situation where they're talking about controversy. So those were the questions that I started out with. And I identified first-year French textbooks that had been reviewed in the French Review across those 3 decades. So just the book review sections. Anything that was a first-year review, we put in the list of books that we wanted to get a hold of. And then I bought those that were available on Amazon, and a lot of them are really cheap, you know. And so this is a way you can collect a lot of your data, and it doesn't cost very much. I and my assistant, we identified and transcribed sections containing reference to Canada and Quebec. And so we ended up with these big files containing those data. And then we actually coded segments containing reference to the Quiet Revolution themes. Okay, and so for this, it wasn't just the search of the key words, but we actually went through and anything that fit in those kinds of themes. And I'm going to show you examples of those. We then looked at the sample sizes for each decade, which is what I'm going to show you. We counted numbers of references to Quiet Revolution topics in each of those 3 decades. And we examined the way that the controversy was presented to the students, so that actually, you know, away from the quantitative side to the qualitative look at the language of controversy that appears in the textbooks. And then we evaluated the value of the presentation for teaching students how to discuss political controversy. Okay, so our sample sizes, we got a lot of the books from the 60s. There weren't as many. There were 13 books that had been reviewed, and we got 83% of those. In the 70s, there were a lot more books. There were 24 books reviewed, and we only got 38% of those. Okay, but still, you know, more than a couple. And in the 80s, there were 46 books reviewed, and we got 48% of those. So our 70 sample is not as large as I would like it to be. The other 2, though, are pretty good, I think. Okay, so here are the percentage of references. If you look in the first row there, the percentage of texts that mention Canada. Okay, in all 3 decades, most of the texts at least mention Canada. Although I have to point out here that mention can mean something like this. Je vais au Canada. Okay, count that one. Okay, there's a mention. So the mention of Canada really is not necessarily substantial. The third column there, is a percentage of texts that have the Canadian cultural information. So something beyond that, you know, Je vais au Canada, if there's anything more than that. Still in the 60s, there's not really very much. Well, I mean, you didn't teach about Canada very much in the 60s, you know, so, but in the, and then it, you know, around half and more than that in the 70s and 80s, where there would be some additional information about Canada. Of those, in the 70s, 22%, 2 books, and in the 80s, almost half of the books have something about the Quiet Revolution. So it's by the 80s that the Quiet Revolution information is to about half of the books in the sample anyway. Okay, so those are the ones that I'm going to look at in a little more detail now, to look at the actual language that is used to present the controversy. It can be presented as simply as a single sentence, even though Quebec is a Canadian province. The Québécois try to maintain their French culture. Okay, 1 sentence. Okay. Here's one from a book in the 70s that has a really long, by Buttriff, who's maybe, you know, people know probably. And that has a fairly substantial presentation of controversy, and so you see the language. The if Quebec City is a memory of the old world, Montreal is the image of the new world. Okay, so you have kind of this parallel contrast kind of language. Difficult to define the character of the French Canadian, because it's going to talk about the 2 sides to the character of the French Canadian. The 2 official languages, but French is the only official language. So this contrast is 2 sides. There are some people who are afraid to see the traditional French life disappear in the style of life completely Americanized. The quiet revolution of a new government slowly transforms the country. Okay, the idea of transformation. Soon the idea of national independence. So we actually have the independence idea there. In the second one here, all the Quebecois are not supporters of independence, but 30% believe it is necessary. So you see there are two sides to this. There's a controversy within. Remaining in the Canadian Confederation would mean radically Anglicizing. Okay, so these are the kinds of things. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through these and not talk about all of them because of the time. In the 80s, so that was really the only one in the 70s. There were only two books that had anything, and that one had quite an extensive piece that really did bring in the language of controversy. In the 80s, we have a lot that's presented in English in this particular example, and it goes through kind of the whole story there, which I won't read because of time. And we also have throughout, this is in about half of the books of the 80s, we have other pieces, other little vignettes, cultural notes, things that come out in dialogues. The idea of losing ground in the face of the influence of the English. There are insurmountable problems. When there are two Anglophones in a group, everyone speaks English. They begin to put into question the Anglophone dominance. Vive le Québec libre becomes the Live Quebec, Free Quebec becomes a rally cry. So some of the political stuff. They talk about the Anglophone domination. The companies are controlled by the Anglophones. The Québécois feel very isolated. There's always a battle, the fight. You know, the word "fight" is actually used, or battle. Ethnic minority. Okay, so these are some of the words. And there are a number of. This is the most common thing where it's factually presented. These kinds of issues about Quebec and kind of the quiet revolution and the aftermath. We see this only in a few cases in dialogues where these topics are brought up. This is a dialogue that takes place among people in France. Jessica, nationality unknown, is speaking to Françoise, who is Quebecois. Jessica says, and they're in France, and the French woman that they're staying with has already said, "Oh, the Disneyland and all these things ruining France," and Jessica says to the Quebecois, "Well, I mean, with you in Canada, between the English Canadians and the United States, I mean, you have the same crisis." Okay, using the word crisis. And Françoise says, "Well, yeah, but for us, you know, it just reinforces us. It just makes us stronger to be in this situation." Okay, so there's one place where there's a little dialogue. Another case, we have a dialogue where we've got two French people, Marie and Jean, are in Quebec. Pierrette is Québécoise, and then le cocher is the guy who rides in Quebec City. They have horse and carriage things, and so this is the guy who's driving the horse here. Pierre, the Québécois says, "Well, you know, in Quebec we've passed a law saying that all the signs have to be in French, and that French is the only official language of the province." And the guy riding the horse, they're talking to the French people. The guy riding the horse says, "Yeah, the Anglophones are not happy at all." And then goes on to, and now we're at the hotel. so there, you know, is that little bit of an exchange in that conversation. In this other conversation, we've got a Québécois, Gilles, again talking about how proud we are, and Marianne is saying, oh, because you're living surrounded by English, and yes, we've saved our language and our culture in this setting. This isn't really a dialogue, but it's a Quebecois who is speaking, and it just appears as a list of sentences. I'm Quebecoise and I'm proud. I'm a member of the Parti Québécois, which is the political organization whose goal is a separate or independent Quebec. I want my country to separate from the rest of Canada. When it comes to finding an American in these dialogues, though, they're rare. I found one, that this Bill is definitely American. They drove across the border, he's American, and he asked the question at one point, well, do you think of yourself as a little French? And to which the reply is, well, do you think of yourself as a little English? and so he says, no, of course you don't. We're Quebecois, you're American. So that's it, though. That's the only dialogue in the 41 books that I looked at. This was the only dialogue where I saw an American engaged in this kind of conversation. And I'll skip this one due to time to go to conclusions. So I started out with the question, would text published closer to the time period include explicit references to the Quiet Revolution and related controversy? Through this period, there is an increase in the number of texts that include issues of the Quiet Revolution controversy. Okay, it goes from 0 in the 60s to 22% in the 70s and 48% in the 80s. Controversy is presented. We do find some examples of how the controversy is presented. And here, this is, we're looking specifically at the language, and I put this just in very simple terms. There are semantic and grammatical markers of contrast. There are words indicating change, loss, fear, words indicating threat, problems, dominance, presentation of an adversary. That's the English, and the Americans are the adversary. We are clear, and that appears throughout. Presentation of the politics of independence, the Parti Québécois, etc. Are there dialogues showing interlocutors discussing controversy? There are a few, but most of the presentation of controversy is reported by the third-person narrator, okay? It's the genre of conversation is what these students really need. The genre of historical kind of narration is what they're seeing in their beginning level in textbooks. Do we see Americans engaging in dialogue concerning controversy? I didn't see that in the dialogues that I looked at. Of course, I was looking only at the ones concerning Canada, but I did not see that. So in a sense, we have a controversy. It was big then. It's still important now. In a sense, it's just all history, right? It's kind of, it's black and white. It is the past. But if you go to Quebec, if you're in Canada, and if you're in that region of Canada, and even because of television, you see the controversy continue. Okay, there's the Bloc Québécois. He just lost his seat, but anyway, last year anyway, this is a Bloc Québécois representative for the federal government talking to the Prime Minister. The controversy continues. There's the leader of the Parti Québécois, which exists still in Quebec. There's the Prime Minister of Canada, and there's a Bloc Québécois. So the controversy continues. It's alive, and it's really important for conversations that students in study abroad might actually have when they go to Quebec and study abroad. So I will end there. The stop sign is out, and so I'll just thank you.
Good morning. All right. In this paper, I will describe the way in which I have used Michael Byram's 1997 model of intercultural competence as a framework, let me get my slide going, to articulate learning outcomes for a university French conversation course module I call Francophone Interviews. I guess I'm not ready for that one. And I will share an analysis of my study findings drawn from pre- and post-module student questionnaires. Appraising the study results through the lens of Byram's model suggests that the Francophone Interviews module does have a varied yet variable impact on advancing students' intercultural competence. I'm going to begin by describing the context of the French conversation class and the Francophone Interviews module within that university course. Next, I will describe the curricular module and its various phases of implementation in and outside the classroom setting. And finally, I'll talk about my study design, findings, interpretations, and some possible implications. So now we're ready for these references. The Francophone Interviews module is designed to advance students' oral language use and foster their development of intercultural competence via a third-place experience with native speakers. As Renata Schultz had brought to the fore in her 2007 article that you see referenced here, the profession has lingered on a path greatly in need of models for the teaching and assessment of students' attainment of cultural competence. So it seems to me that we have kind of muddled about for some time, working our way through big C, little c, culture capsules, products, practices, perspectives, all these little advancements, all of which actually have certainly advanced the discussion, but yet seem to continue to fall short of effectively addressing the profession's satisfaction on this kind of knotty issue of practice. And as Heidi kind of reiterated again this morning, and I identified this 2010 MLJ Perspectives section which she wrote, and she pointed out that the profession experiences continued dissatisfaction with the outcome of its efforts to address culture in the curriculum. However, I believe that the good news is we're here today. We're at this conference and a gathering focused on this topic. And for me as well, some promising trend, and I felt like there was a kind of a notable corpus of discussion on intercultural competence at ACTFL this year as well. So that was encouraging for me and my particular research interest. So I trust that my study will contribute in some small way to these discussions as well as to our practices. So to give you a little bit of context, my interviews module, which is designed to facilitate a learning experience that fosters intercultural competence, is a course assignment that represents one among other efforts in our Modern Language and Culture degree program at my institution, Kennesaw State. The setting for my study is a course module within the undergraduate French conversation class, as I've said, and the class is designated as a skills level course in our undergraduate degree program where we have 3 majors. French is one of the majors. And it's what we call skills level course. It's a 3,000 level course. So comprised within broadly stated learning outcomes for the integration of intercultural competence in our major sequence, which we've adopted across the whole Modern Language and Culture program, I've articulated these 3 specific module outcomes. These aren't my course outcomes, but for this particular assignment, which I have designed as performance-based student learning outcomes. Now, given these contextual factors, I should emphasize that the overriding impetus of my particular research is curricular. My inquiry is focused on a quest for more effective instructional approaches that weave intercultural competence into our curricular framework in an integrated and intentional manner. That is, the driving purpose of the Francophone Interviews module is to facilitate learning experiences that will hold some potential, hopefully, for cultivating intercultural competence in students. Therefore, I'm not necessarily looking at individual student cases, but rather exploring the collective case of students that are typically associated with the context of this intermediate level type undergraduate course. I'm drawing my conclusions based on patterns across 3 semesters of data collection, and in an article that I was fortunate to have accepted to the NECTFL review that came out just this month, I said that although this process of student evaluation may be thorny and consistent clear-cut paths for navigating these kind of thorny and difficult roadblocks are elusive, I believe that the module presents authentic and meaningful opportunity for students to advance their intercultural competencies. So I've drawn from the scholarship, this is something you can look at if you want to look at my PowerPoint later, of Byram, Coles, Elola, and Ascos, Fantini, and Scarino, and have come up with, this is kind of my operational definition as it is today. So it's this multifaceted ability, the reflection of deliberate awareness and conscious decentering, and further undergirding my kind of evolving definition of intercultural competence is the work of Robinson, Stewart, and Nocon, which Blair Bateman then built on later, and the ways in which they present culture as a process, a way of perceiving, interpreting, feeling, being in the world, relating to where one is and who one meets. And as I read their words, it really resonates with the kind of premises of my thinking and my study. So I have employed the framework that we're all, I think, quite familiar with, Michael Byram's model of intercultural competence. And in this model, he, of course, has the 5 goal areas. And in my study, I drew from the 29 objectives that he outlines within these 5 goal areas. And I identified 10 that link to the general nature of students' intercultural learning experiences in my little Francophone Interviews project that they do. And so the 10 objectives represent all 5 of his areas or domains of savoir. So it was 2 objectives coming from each. With an eye toward assessment of student development in intercultural competence, I drew on his work as foundational, an impetus for kind of putting a frame to this slippery notion of intercultural competence. That is, I identified his model as a point of departure for me and my project for exploring the construct of intercultural competence and for taking a closer look at his articulated features of intercultural competence and how they might be evaluated over a particular time span. So, with respect to the instructional delivery, I have these 5 steps, and the locus of control while I'm working on this project with my students really does kind of shift over time, beginning with more the teacher-facilitated mode, merging increasingly into student-directed work. And you can see the steps here. So the first step really is kind of introducing the project. They get an overview. If they need help identifying native speakers, I help them with some resources there. The second step really is focusing on the development of the questions. And at the same time, we begin kind of these discussions about cultural sensitivity and courtesy. And then in step 3, it's more work with the interview questions. And at this point, I'm working a little bit more with them on some explicit training, so to speak, or understanding of ethnographic interview techniques and this approach of probing a point, being responsive to what your interviewee says and kind of following their lead and asking follow-up questions based on what they say. In the 4th step, they go out and they do their interviews, and then the 5th step, they come back to class and individually give their visually supported student presentations. So, although the present study or study time frame that I'm reporting on today with you grew out of the pilot that is what I reported on in the NECTFL review, I'm looking at fall 2010 and spring 2011, the data from those 2 semesters. And this study design that I have kind of evolved over time. As I crafted the module, I looked at data that were coming out of some informal collecting of data in the early years when I was trying this just as a class activity. I field tested, developed a questionnaire and field tested it for some stronger validation. I got feedback from colleagues when I could and looked a little further into the literature, especially Bateman's work on the ethnographic interview in foreign language classes. And so in addition to what I'm reporting today, I have data set from this past fall that's unanalyzed, and I'm doing it again this semester. So it's kind of an interesting iterative process for me that is evolving, and hopefully with what I'm learning now and feedback I may get from you, we can keep tweaking this. So you see my research questions here, and I don't want to read them to you because I think you can read them and they're pretty basic. Do we see some change happening between the pre and post, and the qualitative data, might that support it? So here's my pretty small group of participants with those 2 semesters. It's a cross-section of kind of 2nd through 4th year undergraduate students. There were the total of 27 within those 2 semesters. 7 of them, and this is self-reporting information, 7 of them are majoring in French. 8 are minoring, and the remaining 3 are taking the course kind of as an elective. The male-female distribution of this small population of students was 1 male to every 3.5 females, including 1 heritage student, not of Francophone heritage. There were 6 students who self-identified as international students, for them meaning not born in the U.S., but none of them from Francophone places. So that is about 29% of the participants who come to the class, or to these 2 class sections, with some prior intercultural experience of some type. And of those 6 that self-identified as international students, 3 reported English as a second or additional language. So here's some information about my questionnaire. I did do a mixed method study using this pre-post questionnaire instrument to collect the quantitative data. The questionnaire has 30 Likert scale items in English, and you can kind of see what I did when I identified Byram's objectives that kind of linked to the project. So there's 2 objectives coming from each goal area, and then each objective has 3 items on the questionnaire. And then there's 1 open-ended item, and you're going to see some student feedback from that in a few minutes. So in the analysis of these data, I considered each of the 5 domains comprehensively. I wanted to look at the data results collectively, and really considered my quantitative or my questionnaire results with an eye toward each goal area of intercultural competence. So therefore, with respect to these 2 semesters, fall 2010 and spring 2011, when comparing the post-questionnaire grand mean to the mean score on those items, there is significance noted in domains 2 and 4, which you can see here as a little reminder of what those are. In the other 3 domains, 1, 3, and 5, there was no significant or notable change across both semesters. So where do these results point me? Let me remind you really quick about my research questions as a way to frame the findings. First question is, what are the kind of differences in change from pre and post administration, and what might these indicate about some change in intercultural competence during this course module? Well, the answer is there were changes noted in these 2 areas. And as I present my interpretation of the findings, I will weave in some student comments to kind of address the second research question, which was about how do qualitative data perhaps support the quantitative data. All right, so I'm putting up the 3 no change goal areas because I propose that we address these first more quickly so that we can indulge a little bit more in the change areas and what I think possibly that means. So let's see, I've kind of lost track of my place here. Okay, I propose in looking at these that there might be several scenarios that explain the no change. So here's 3 no change scenarios that I just kind of propose. That they don't have any, they come in with no measurable degree and nothing really happened. Maybe they had some degree but stayed the same, or maybe the questionnaire didn't capture change in those areas, and we could propose some other possible ideas. But I'd like to place a little greater confidence in my questionnaire than a scenario 3 proposes, because of the results of my field testing. But I do recognize that only additional applications are going to, ensure any kind of reliability. So the next conference, I'll come back and report, and we'll see where we are. But given the time limitations, let's focus on the goal areas where we saw change. So here now you can see the objectives that I picked among the many objectives that Michael Byram has associated with these goal areas where there change. Of course, the findings need to be, I think my findings support a hypothesis that the module does impact or advance some degree of change. Have to temper those findings because the N is very small, and there are numerous variables, as we know, that generally cannot be controlled for in classroom-based inquiry such as this. And also, I think we need to acknowledge this idea that there's kind of paucity of an exact baseline assessment of intercultural competence that I could give them when they come into the class to have any idea where they are. So that would be, generalizable across all students. So this complexity of variables, the fuzzy nature of the construct of intercultural competence, all of this goes to kind of point that the findings are problematic with respect to any kind of real certain validity, but I think they nevertheless can inform our discussions. So let's look first at this goal 2. Some evidence among the collected qualitative data support some of the, and this is one of these things they tell you never to do. There's way too much text on that slide, and I apologize. I should have split that up. But I think some of these student comments in response to the question, what did you personally gain from the assignment, do support that students gained some better understanding about social groups and their products and practices in their own and or their interviewees' culture. So I want to give you a little time. I don't really want to read to you, but you can see some of I tried to highlight some of the, I think, stronger points that the students made. Regarding change noted in goal area 2, and with respect to this goal of knowledge of the general processes of societal and individual interaction, I posit that these data point to change in this goal area largely in response to the training that we kind of did in class and the use of the ethnographic interviewing techniques. Goal 2 is a knowledge domain, and it speaks to knowing about the processes of socialization. So I would claim that students progressed in their knowledge and understanding of the processes of societal and individual interaction by virtue of that time spent in class discussing and practicing ethnographic interviewing techniques. Let me hasten to add that these student comments may not present strong evidence to substantiate student advancement in notable and specific ways toward deeper understanding of the processes of socialization of particular Francophone cultures, as might be suggested when you look more closely beyond the Michael Byram's wording in the goal and look to the objectives. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to the 4 now, the other area of change. Okay, so with respect to change noted in goal area 4, here again you can see the 2 objectives identified. I would posit that the Francophone Interviews assignment itself is a real impetus for some degree of advancement in this domain. That is, the experience of the students engaging in the cross-cultural interview corresponds more or less to the real-time use of knowledge, skills, and attitudes which occur as they interact with their interviewee. The interview exchange itself and then reporting out on that exchange will, in their classroom presentation, will draw on that kind of elicits information and then explains that information, which you see in A. So I believe that the assignment itself calls upon discovery and interaction abilities. So regardless of where they may be in their intercultural competence, When they enter the class, I believe that this assignment obliges them to some extent in discovery and interaction abilities. So here are some more comments that I felt linked a little bit more strongly with goal 4 with respect to acquire new knowledge of a culture and cultural practices and ability to operate knowledge, attitudes, and skills under the constraints of real-time communication and interaction. So I think I'm going to jump to my conclusion because I think I'm just about out of time. So I'll let you read a little bit more of that while I start this. Exploring this idea a bit further, I might add that for the large majority of students enrolled in the French conversation class at our institution, even noting their varying levels of language proficiency, the act of conducting the interview in a second language is a pretty notable growth experience for them. When the project's first introduced, there's always a corpus of students who exhibit a lot of anxiety, and they testify, oh, I've never used second language, I've never used my French outside class except for school assignments. And even more of them kind of anecdotally state that although they may have used French outside class in non-academic contexts, they've not interacted with a native speaker in an exchange that they identify as formal or at least semi-formal in tone as an interview. So one of my moving forward thoughts is documentation of such testimony could probably be persuasive in supporting my interpretation that this assignment itself is a real impetus for some degree of advancement in this domain, the fourth domain, discovering interaction, that kind of forces them to use that knowledge, skills, and attitudes in real time. And I think also these qualitative data could strengthen the urgency of the message about more meaningful real-life tasks integrated into our curriculum. So to close the presentation, I would like to bring you back to what I claimed earlier. The overriding impetus for me is curricular. My inquiries focused on a quest for more effective instructional approaches that weave intercultural competence into the curricular framework of our language programs in an integrated and more explicit manner. So I've taken a look with this lens at one particular assignment, my module, and my findings indicate that it does have the potential to produce some change in students' intercultural competence in at least 2 of Byram's goal areas. There's always room for further examination of the questionnaire, and it's time for me to stop. So let me just, you've been looking at this, and these are what I had thought about with respect to change in the actual instructional delivery or implementation, some more consciousness-raising activities that kind of nudge them in more self-direction in their knowledge construction and meaning-making. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about a little research project, qualitative research project that I conducted at the Louvre Museum in Paris. And I'm interested in the preparation of teachers of French in my work. And then I'm going to take you to the Louvre Museum. We're going to go all together and look at some data. But first I'd like to start with a quote. Let's just go back to the beginning. It's from A Brief History of the Future. It's an essay from Jacques Attali. The capacity to travel will become a major aspect of academic and professional training. We will have to constantly demonstrate the skills of a traveler to be able to get a job. Overall, in 25 years, about 50 million people will live in a place other than their native country or the native country or of their parents. So if we keep that in mind, as educators, we have to encourage our students to become intercultural mediators, and we in turn also, as educators, have to go in that direction as well. And immersion is a possible strategy to enhance intercultural mediation skills, so it seems. So I'll be discussing the study abroad in a specific program today. So study abroad are academic initiate programs by U.S. institutions that provide students with the opportunity to spend various amounts of time in a foreign country. One of the primary objectives of such programs is to offer opportunities for language and cultural learning through immersion. But when we look at the research, the literature, the reality is not so straightforward. Some recent qualitative scholarship has underlined the complexity of a study abroad experience where, of course, participants negotiate linguistic and cultural meanings in context, but they also turn the gaze inwards, and they also negotiate issues of identity, including race, gender, nationality. So beyond the advertised learning goals of the study abroad programs, it seems that there is a sort of embodied curriculum that is characterized by processes of identity negotiation. And such a second, alternative, parallel curriculum is what I would like to explore today. Let me briefly go back to how I use the term identity. I use it as a sociocultural construct that is dynamic, fluid, multifaceted, and complex, and not limited to a set of variables. And in language and cultural education, many scholars have already inquired into the relationship between identity and language learning in a variety of settings. The study that I'm presenting today is an empirical examination of the negotiation of identity issues in two combined immersion contexts or settings. The study abroad at the Art Museum. So we have those two settings mixed together, and there's not much research being done in this very specific setting. Several questions that could be asked with respect to the relationship between identity and learning across settings. Is for a start, in that particular program that I'm looking at, is there an emerging alternative and embodied curriculum in that setting in immersion? We can't really take that for granted. How the study abroad participants would negotiate potential discursive contradictions, or what I call dissonance in immersion, between what the program advertises and what actually takes place in study abroad. So how do the participants negotiate if there is a discrepancy? How do they negotiate this? And finally, if we find that there is a parallel embodied curriculum behind or in parallel to the official one, how could those experiences could be integrated into the program and into the French language classroom? So I'll try to partially answer these questions. The context of the study is a 2-week training program for teachers of French that takes place at the Louvre Museum every summer. So for 2 weeks, a group of about 10 to 15 American teachers of French travel to Paris, and every single morning we meet with the Louvre staff, and we have guided tours, conferences, workshops with the museum staff, and also with the education staff of the French department of, say, a large public university in New Jersey, to situate. So that's the context of the study. It's part of my dissertation research, and it's a qualitative case study of the culture and identity learning experiences of this group of American teachers of French who are enrolled in the 2-week training program at the Louvre. The study is interpretive and empirical in nature, and it's based on the data that I collected on site in naturalistic settings in 2010. The data for the study was collected during a workshop at the Louvre Museum. That day, the teachers, the staff from the U.S. university and the docents were gathered to discuss the possible integration of the Louvre collections into the world language classroom, the French classroom specifically. There were 6 female U.S. teachers of French who took part in the discussion. and one docent and 2 French native speakers from the American University, including myself. And in this study, I will report only on a very small section of this 3-hour discussion that took place at the Louvre, and I will go back to one single work of art. The conversations were audio taped, transcribed verbatim, sent to participants for member check. And then I used ethnographic data to follow up, to identify and to trace similar references to the artwork or to the various identity motifs that were emerging from the analysis and from the data. So let's have a look at this data. For a start, on the 2nd floor of the Sully aisle of the Louvre hangs this painting. It's called Le Verrou, or The Bolt, and it's a painting by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, an 18th century artist. And after spending some time with the artwork myself and with the existing commentaries of this painting, I decided to submit Le Verrou to the participants' scrutiny and see what they would be saying about it. This painting, if we can briefly describe it, it's divided in 2 parts. On the right, there's a man and a woman who embrace in front of a door. The light falls on them, underlining the 2 characters' actions and movements. Facing each other, their bodies are stretched towards the door, their hands reaching for the lock. Over there, on the right. On the left, there are some white drapes that are ruffled on a canopy, a dark red and velvety drape that falls on an empty bed. And that part of the painting on the left is dimmer, except for a ray of light that falls on an apple that is standing on a nightstand, which could look like a nightstand. So the scene takes place in a boudoir or in a bedroom, and immediately begs for a story. What just happened? Or what is going to happen? Who are these 2 characters? And when we at the Louvre, when the participants were confronted to this painting, they immediately picked up on this need for a narrative. So the viewing of this painting, and I'll come back to it, generates conversations about identity in several ways. First, the participants picked up on the need for a narrative attached to the painting. However, very quickly, 2 different interpretations of the narrative here emerged, underlining the embodied experiences of the female participants viewing this painting. Second, the narratives that emerged during the viewing of the painting were actually echoed in the participants' accounts of their experiences in Paris, in France. While in France, the female participants, like many other study abroad female participants, encountered gender issues in their own bodies and also projected in the bodies of others. And I'll explain that. And third, one participant's gendered experiences in Paris and at the museum were reinvested in the foreign language classroom through critical awareness of gender gaps in the museum's collections, but also in her own French classroom. So that day, and we'll go back to it, that day, the participants highlighted a parallel embodied curriculum behind the program in the viewing of this painting. And this curriculum could actually be integrated into the world language classroom, and I'll give you examples of how we can do that. So back to that day at the Louvre when we were looking at the painting. This is the beginning, an excerpt of the conversation that took place that day between Solène and Louise and Agathe, who are some of the participants. As you shall see, Solène is the one who dominates the beginning of the conversation. And she voices her strong personal and professional rejection of the painting. To her, Le Verrou, the bolt that we've seen before, is extremely violent. And it tells the story of the rape of a woman. She justifies this view to the other participants who adopt her interpretation. And then Solène and the group, there's more to this conversation, but basically Solène and the group piece together the following narrative about the painting. The man is, quote, closing the door so that the woman can't escape, and the door is locked, end of quote. The woman refuses and reaches for the door, end of quote, but, quote, the boy, he closes, and the woman grabs to flee. So at the end of this interaction where they're piecing together this narrative of rape, the docent intervenes and actually suggests that there might be another interpretation, an alternative narrative when we look at this painting. An alternative story would be a story of seduction, where the man does not close the lock to prevent the women from fleeing, but rather to ensure some privacy, where the woman is not a victim of masculine violence, but a consenting lover, where her position in the arms of the man does not indicate fear or restraint, but instead a flirtatious pause that encourages seduction. Also, in this painting, there are some ambiguities and inconsistencies, and especially in the linearity of time that characterizes the narratives that described so far. It is very unclear if the moment that is captured here is the prelude, the interlude, or the aftermath of a love scene. It's not clear. For instance, the characters are still half-dressed. This could indicate that something is about to happen. In contrast, the ruffled bed and the sheets on the bed may signal that something already took place. And so the uncertainty of the time frame of the painting seems rather staged on purpose. And so is the resulting confusion when viewing the scene. There's also the apple on the nightstand on the left that could symbolize sexual temptation and profound love. It's important to know that this painting was created in parallel with the biblical scene of the birth of Jesus. So when exhibited together, the two paintings present a portrait of love in its secular and sacred dimensions. There's also a lot of playfulness that perspires from this painting. The game of seduction is linked to the 18th century libertine philosophy at that time, so we could talk about that too. So this alternative narrative, we have the narrative of rape, and then we have the narrative of seduction. It's a complex narrative structure with representations of love, and at the end of this exchange, after the docent presented this alternative narrative, Solène, our most vocal participant, acknowledges the possibility of a different narrative, but she still remains disconcerted, and she admits, okay, I don't know anymore. And in this conversation, the female participants relate to the female character in the painting, describing her as a victim. Their female gaze on the female figure is characterized by the idea of violence and inequality. And I thought of that this feminine narrative about gender is echoed in the participants' personal narrative about life in Paris. And so I followed up with those narratives. So there seems to be a relationship between the participants' gendered experience abroad and their narrative about femininity, sexuality, and gender when viewing Le Verrou at the museum. That day at the Louvre, Solène was very outspoken about Le Verrou, the bolt, that she interpreted as a narrative of rape. And in her diary and post-program interviews, she frequently recalled some very unpleasant experiences with French men while in France. And this is very typical to the study abroad data. Here, she explains that a stranger on a train started a conversation about the tragic accident that left his body scarred. And Solène attributes the man's readiness to share his tragedy to her own nature because she attracts storytellers. That's what she says. However, she also underlines her stupor at having to negotiate a whole new level of narrative performance in this encounter. And she ridicules the lively scene, but her sense of humor seems to belie a strong grasp of her powerlessness during such an encounter. And there is another one with Solène, another encounter. This time she's the misunderstood victim of a random male gaze in the street when a man approaches her as she was walking and casually asks her if she's pregnant. And she's not. So she first interprets this remark as a failed attempt at seducing her. And in similar instances, she said she would have, quote, ignore him the way I learned to do in France, end of quotes. Then she jokes and she attributes this man's faux pas to her own love of pastries that she probably abused when she was in Paris. Nevertheless, despite the humor that she injects in her comments, she was left speechless and powerless in that street that day. So if I summarize quickly so far, here we have identity and gender specifically that is negotiated across settings. It's negotiated at the museum, but also in the streets of Paris. And it emerges as part of an embodied curriculum. And the museum and the collection can make this hidden or parallel curriculum visible through discussion about various paintings. In addition, the gender norms that were encountered in immersion in that program can also be resisted. And these negative embodied experiences can be turned around and used positively in immersion and in the French language classroom. This is what Solène, our very vocal participant, did by designing a set of lesson plans about female painters, French female painters that she wanted to use in her classroom. And so at the end of the program, we worked really closely together to try to go further in this strategy of resistance that she started. So she resisted the gender norms she encountered in several ways. First, she noted a striking imbalance at the Louvre, where the male artists are overly represented, and so she chose to work with female painters. Another focus of her resistance to gender inequalities is her interest in the representation of women. And so, turning the gaze inward, she offers to study the portraits of 18th century women executed by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who was a female painter at the time. And doing so, she also challenged the canon as exhibited at the Louvre Museum. Another dimension of resistance is how she addressed the gender imbalances in her own classroom, where she says most of her students are female. She has an AP class. Most of her students are female, and they do not seem to be presented with a diverse French curriculum that brings awareness to gender. And so she counters what she perceives as a gap with those lesson plans. And third, Solène kind of transcended her personal experiences in the program through the portfolio and the activities, because she seems to be aware of the issues of being a woman in Paris. So using her personal experience, she regained her voice and symbolic power through reflective practice and the development of lesson plans. And let me very quickly give you a couple of ideas on how we work together on implementing this lesson plan so that it would contribute to the development of an embodied and intercultural curriculum. And we did so essentially through engagement with cultural and personal narratives. Because Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun was a painter, but she also wrote her memoir. And she painted the portraits of the nobility in exile in Europe after the French Revolution. And while she painted, she gave visual portraits, she also wrote textual portraits. And so we can really work with text and image and this idea of personal narratives in the classroom. For instance, we could use the portraits that she made of herself and her daughter as a woman, being an artist, but also as a mother. And we could encourage students to vary the point of view and go back to the text, writing it maybe from another perspective. Why not from the perspective of the daughter or from the perspective of the absent father? You know, since we're discussing gender. There's also, we could be varying text time, looking at self-portraits of Vigée Lebrun at different times, and try to imagine what happened in between, and try to fill in the blanks using her memoir, but also other texts and documents from the same time. One specific activity that I think could really be beneficial in terms of intercultural awareness would be switching perspective on historical events. Because Vigée Lebrun was the official painter of the Queen Marie-Antoinette, who was beheaded at the end of the French Revolution. And so she was part of the inner circle of royalty at that time. And we could, for example, we could encourage students to read texts about the trial of the king and queen, and maybe replay this trial. Some of the class could play defense, others could play prosecution, they could rewrite history. And I think in this kind of activity, there would be interesting intercultural perspectives on justice that could emerge and that could be discussed as a class. And finally, in her memoirs and in her paintings, Vigée Lebrun refers a lot to les émigrés, which is this category of aristocrats, French aristocrats who fled France during the Revolution. And we could, in that case, try to compare the experience of exile yesterday and today, because who are the exiles today and why, and maybe have some discussions on those issues. And all of these little examples, activities contributing, hopefully, to the development of an embodied and intercultural curriculum in the French language classroom. Thank you.
It's quite lucky that I'm following Kristin here. I see some links between our work. I'd like to start by asking you just for a moment to focus on what image comes to mind when I say immersion contexts, which is the focus of our conference. I'm going to venture a guess that for many of you, or at least some of you, a study abroad context comes to mind. A perusal of our conference program would indicate a similar finding that many of us think of study abroad or an immigration context, another situation where people have relocated to another country, to another region where a second language is spoken. What I'd like to do with my presentation today, though, is to stretch our concept of what constitutes an immersion context and to try to convince you that the foreign language learning classroom itself, the instructional context, is indeed a rightful place to think about immersion. Before we leave this first slide, I just want to orient you to the images that are around the border. These are some of the texts, some of the photographic texts, some of the film texts along the right-hand side, and one novel, a linguistic text, that are part of the narrative world that makes up the class that I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so immersion is a concept that I've dealt with a little bit in a fairly recent publication in the Modern Language Journal's Perspective columns. This is the one that was edited by Heidi Burns that Kristin was referencing, where I write that even as we agree that culture is part and parcel of all foreign language learning, we persist in our conviction that legitimate forms of cultural immersion and therefore deep levels of understanding only occur through direct experience with native speakers of a language in a land that they inhabit. Of course, we know from study abroad research that that's not exactly the case, that linguistic and cultural gains are highly variable across participants, and that conceiving of study abroad as a monolithic construct and setting up an equation where study abroad equals linguistic and cultural learning is overly simplistic. The reverse proposition that foreign language classrooms are not conducive to deep levels of cultural understanding and developing them is equally simplistic and equally false. So that's what I hope to do here today, is convince you of that in an evidence-based way. So I'll have some data to back up that claim. So if we think about cultural learning, intercultural learning, transcultural learning, they have been all generously theorized in our field to date and researched to some extent in empirical ways. If we look, for example, to the MLA report that came out in 2007, in the past 5 years, this report has had what I would say is pretty major impact on our discussions of what the desired outcomes are of foreign language and other forms of second language education. Although the report is aimed at making us think about a reconceptualization of foreign language education at the university level, the overriding concepts here about translingual competence, transcultural understanding obviously have further reach. In the report, those two goals are posited as equal goals in foreign language education. It was interesting to hear Heidi talk this morning about prioritizing the advanced language competency, though, and I think I have to agree with her on that. So these concepts are anchored in a notion of language that is constitutive rather than instrumental, and there I'm borrowing directly from the report's language. Pushing our ideas of meaning and negotiation of meaning in the foreign language classroom to the fore in a much deeper way than has perhaps been the case in the past. So at the core of the report's model of developing transcultural understanding is the interpretation of cultural narratives that the report claims are inherent in all forms of expression. Claire Cronch, who's one of the authors of the MLA report, also discusses this move away from a notion of foreign language education that seeks to prepare learners for transactional purposes and trains them in the use of instrumental language, if we conceive it that way, in her work on symbolic competence. So rather than some of the ideas of communicative competence that we've held, she talks about the modern students need to understand deeper meanings to become adept in the manipulation of symbolic systems and to understand indeed the process of meaning making itself. So culture in foreign language education understood in this way takes on a much more deeply and broadly semiotic orientation, one that entails instruction and activity that leads to an expansion of students' meaning-making repertoires. For me, this is a fairly significant turn in our field, a major turn for us to think about theory and instruction. So, of course, we've seen a focus on interpretation and meaning-making in Byram's initial work on intercultural competence. It's one of the areas of skill that he talks about, skills of interpretation. I've looked to Kristel's work that I've seen presented at a previous conference for empirical work on how teachers, in this case, can develop their ability to interpret and make meaning. So with that framework in place, this discussion and this turn also raises some practical concerns for us. So I've focused on these two questions. So if we're to develop transcultural understanding, how exactly does an expansion of learners' meaning-making repertoires unfold in the foreign language classroom? What are the processes, the teaching and learning processes that constitute cultural learning, interpretation of cultural narratives, and generation of meaning around them? Once we identify those processes, how might we encourage teachers to facilitate that kind of development in their classrooms? So these seem to me to be the essential questions. The study that I conducted took place in a 5th semester French course. So this was one level beyond the language requirement, so it was therefore an elective course for the students involved. I'll focus on an 8-week project, although I was a participant observer in the class for the full semester. I collected field notes that I composed after my observations. There were video recordings of the class that I transcribed later. I interviewed participants and looked at the production of student work. So we'll look just at that 8-week project. The students in the class, there were 14. mostly American-born. One, I should change this, it was actually one student who self-identified as an international student. There were also some students who identified as bicultural, and in their minds this was that they had one American-born parent and then another parent of another nationality. So a range of experiences and cultural backgrounds that they were claiming. The focus of this 8 weeks was the French experience, and I probably should say French experiences of World War II, to emphasize the multiplicity of perspectives that were taken up in this project. The project was organized around a global simulation. That's something that Béatrice Dupuis works on here at Circle. The idea behind a global simulation is that there's an extended engagement with the recreation of some context. So there's some kind of backdrop. In this case, it was the two Paris apartment buildings that you see represented on a handout that the teacher gave to her students during the first week of this project. That world is then populated with some characters. So it's a virtual world, but one that is grounded in culturally and or historically, I don't want to say facts exactly, but realities. So this was the organization of the course. So this meant then that the class activity involved first a building up of knowledge of events. There was a 50-page course pack that had images, primary source documents like the transcripts of speeches, and also I guess what you would call sort of encyclopedic-like descriptions of events. So there was the building up of knowledge about events and historical figures, and then more through the in-class activities of clarification, discussion, and analysis. The students were engaged in identifying the prevailing standpoints on all of those things at various moments of the war. So this reference network then became the basis for the students writing first-person fictional memoirs of someone who lived in Paris at the time of the war. So the students' characters all lived in these two buildings, and the teacher's prompts forced students to interweave their stories to some degree. So their characters were interacting, the individual stories were woven together, but there were also cultural narratives that were interwoven with these more individual level narratives. So as the students did analysis activities, discussions in class, there were sort of the stories of individual figures, but there were also, and by cultural narratives I mean things like the collaborationist narrative, the resistance narrative, people who sort of fell in between and were demonstrating some indifference or at least some distance from those two sides. The pétainiste or the Gaulliste narratives, the Jewish narrative, the anti-Semitic narratives, all of these are what I mean by cultural narratives, and these are just some that I saw emerging through the class activity. So, as you can imagine, a very rich intertextuality emerging through the class interaction and also through the students' writing. This other part down here, the students did on some occasions, although this was not the major focus of their class activity, they adopted the voice of their character through a weekly café de retrouvailles where the characters met up 60 years after the fact to talk about their episodes of their experience during this period of history. There was also a one-time recording that was of a confessional type at the end of the project, where they spoke through the voices of their characters, quite literally. Okay, so as I read through my transcripts of classroom interaction and my field notes and my analytical memos, narratives on individual and cultural scales were impossible to ignore as central to the functioning of this class. Engagement with the interpretation of stories and the generation of new cultural narratives and new individual stories opened up a space in this class for inhabiting various perspectives, which Byram, and this is Ketra Byram, not Michael Byram, who we're often more familiar with, Ketra Byram at Ohio State, has taken up this idea of perspective. So she agrees with me in language learning. We're talking about an engagement with perspectives, but she makes a really interesting point, a very useful one. She talks about the analytical power of that term perspective. Cultural perspectives are linked to linguistic perspective, encoded in linguistic perspective, referenced in linguistic forms. They're recoverable by looking at things like deixis, person deixis, tense deixis, lexical, grammatical, and syntactic choices. I was very inspired by Heidi's talk this morning, especially because I agree that we need to look at the language piece more and focus on that in our work with students. I used some tools of linguistic anthropology. I just cite Asif Agha here as one example. He talks about the ways that linguistic forms, many of the ones that Katra Byram references, have metafunctions to set up alternating textual voices. So they set up models of identity, either named voices, unnamed voices, specifiable voices, or typifiable voices that he talks about. So this is the way we can link up from the linguistic forms to the larger perspectives. Okay, so to show you some data, because I want to make sure that we, oh boy, there's a video in here. I hope this is not bad news for us. Okay, anyway, to look at some of the data, this is just a chart summarizing the narratives that were apparent on just my first day of observation. So you've got narratives that range from the individual. There is a discussion, I guess 1, 2, 3, for the fifth row there was a discussion of some stories that the students had read for homework about children who had experienced, people who had experienced the war as children. So there were individual stories. There were stories that were personal to the instructor. Emilie talked about her grandfather and grandmother at the start of the war. She tells a story about her grandfather who was out on patrol, comes back to his camp and finds that it's been bombed and that he and his the other soldier who was with him find that they're the only survivors. So she tells these personal stories. And then you have some more broad cultural narratives. So just to give you an example, it's the first row that I'm going to refer to. So the instructor quite explicitly names this cultural narrative. She calls it the French on bikes. And this is the picture up on the top of the screen here. This was on their weekly schedule. It was the image that was on the top of their weekly schedule for that week. So she calls it the French on bikes. She says, if you say to a French person, été 36, the summer of 36, this is likely an image that they will think of. So she is identifying the symbol. She's giving them the language that is attached to this symbol. And then she goes on to situate it in a world of broader cultural narratives. So she asks them, who is it that was responsible for the French being able to ride bikes because they have paid vacation for the first time and they're seeing the sea for the first time? Who's responsible for this during the pre-Second World War period? So they've read about this a little bit, and they say les Emblems, and they say the Front Populaire and the socialist government. So there is a socialist narrative that gets invoked. This is a socialist narrative that will be re-signified by the Vichy government throughout the war, and that this story of les Emblems is going to continue. He happens to be a Jew, so he's a good scapegoat for the new Vichy government. Anyway, so I won't go into all the details of the richness, but my point here is that there was a great range of cultural narratives and a great depth attached to all symbols and cultural references that came up in the class. I wanted to give you some sense of the depth of that reference network. So, establishing an environment rich in cultural narratives, cultural symbols, is, in my eyes, a first step in allowing our students to become immersed in the foreign language classroom, in others' perspectives, and helping them to stretch their meaning-making potentials. But mere exposure, as many of us know, isn't enough. Treating cultural narratives as the objects of discussion doesn't necessarily lead to the same kind of engagement as what I'll suggest. So what we're going to see here is a 2-minute clip of the teacher. It's just the beginning parts of an activity where she's going to give them some practice in shifting perspective, and she's going to model for them exactly how she hopes they'll do it in their writing project.
Voilà, alors, maintenant, ce que j'aimerais que nous fassions, c'est que nous analysions cette image-là, parce que là, on entre dans la propagande vichiste. Vous allez voir, le maréchal Pétain, à partir du moment où il devient le chef de l'État, on ne parle plus de président, on verra ça jeudi, il va devenir le chef de l'État. Toute sa politique va être basée sur une propagande intense. Et ça, c'est un des premiers exemples de la propagande pétainiste. Ce que j'aimerais que vous fassiez, c'est que vous identifiez les détails iconographiques et que vous les analysiez. Déjà, donc, au premier plan, à l'arrière-plan, à gauche, à droite, au centre. D'accord? Alors, dites-moi, on va déjà analyser l'arrière-plan. Qu'est-ce que ça représente, l'arrière-plan? Est-ce que vous voyez ça? Je vais faire ça comme ça. C'est bon? Oui, peut-être mieux. Qu'est-ce qu'il y a à l'arrière-plan, derrière le maréchal Pétain? Donc, à droite. Ça
La
représente
ruine
quoi?
de la France.
Comment?
La ruine.
La ruine de la France. D'accord? Le chaos. Oui.
Le couleur de le ciel derrière Pétain, c'est très noir. Et maréchal Pétain, c'est clair, c'est blanche. Et le couleur le Seine, enfin, Pétain, c'est clair.
Ouais, vous avez tout un contraste clair-obscur. Et ce qui est obscur est derrière. D'accord? Donc physiquement c'est derrière, ça veut dire c'est derrière moi. C'est de l'histoire. La ruine de la France est derrière moi. Moi, nous allons devant, nous allons dans le futur. Donc là à droite c'est la ruine. Concrètement c'est quelle période de la guerre ça? Avec les tanks.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in this short clip, but I just want to stress a few things. So there's a move here, if we compare with the cultural reference we saw with the French on bikes, there's a move here from simple identification of a symbol and situation of a symbol to interpretation of those cultural symbols and cultural narratives. So at the start of the clip, the teacher designates this as an analytical activity. She tells them to identify the iconographic details and then that they'll analyze them together. Well, she says you analyze them, but they end up analyzing them together. And she tells them about how they might approach such an analysis by indicating various portions of the image and that the composition of the image is meaningful itself. So then she invites them to start interpreting what's in the background and what does it represent. So you have a few students, 2 students, initially commenting on it's the ruin of France, it's chaos. So there's a process that cycles through the rest of this interaction that goes on for about 10 to 12 minutes, where there's a movement from literal and figurative meanings to more ideological ones. So here at the beginning, the students are commenting on what they literally see and what some of the figurative meanings might be. A third student who is halting in her use of French, she's maybe the weakest linguistically in the class, but who made incredible gains over the course of the semester, she attempts something a little bit different than the first 2 students, suggesting that the darkness behind Pétain and the light ahead of him means something. Now, she doesn't know exactly how to say what it means, but the teacher recasts in more fluent linguistic terms, more fluent analytical terms, what that meaning is. The teacher then jumps again to another part of this interpretive task, taking them to the ideological meaning. Now, how does she do that? She starts a voicing technique and an embodiment technique. She starts speaking as Pétain. And she starts speaking to the students as if they're the French public who may have encountered this image. Moi, je suis, nous allons devant. So me, I am, we're going toward the future. So she starts modeling for them how repositioning can happen and how they might imagine themselves positioned in these narratives in relation to these texts that they encounter. Okay, just so that we have time to see the other portion of this, the part that I really think is maybe a little newer. Whereas the MLA report talks about interpretation of narratives, I'm really stuck on this notion of the active production of cultural narratives as being the next step in pushing that model forward and helping our students to engage in perspective taking and expanding their meaning-making repertoires even more. So shifts in perspective in the students' writing. So in those in-class interactions, it was much less likely to see the students initiating those kinds of shifts in voice than the teacher. You know, she was modeling them for the students, but then of course in the writing they had to. So how did they achieve these shifts in perspective? Some of the shifts a little bit easier. Shift in place and time. So shifting from a university campus in a United States city to a Paris apartment building. from 2006 to the World War II era, inclusion of certain details, avoidance of anachronistic details. Those kinds of things were one way to make those shifts in perspective possible. But the shift in person and perspective is really the tricky thing. How would a modern day university student with his or her own personal history shift through that writing project to an invented persona whose story plays out in a particular figured world? So I mean the figured world of World War II France and those students' understanding of it, but the figured world of those two apartment buildings too. So this is just one very small excerpt that I hope will make my point. This is from a student's work that came close to the classroom excerpt that you just saw. So the students were writing about their characters at the beginning stages of the war. She's referencing both the speech by Pétain that gives the propaganda, I don't want to say propaganda poster, the text its name, and the analysis of that image in class. So she's weaving all of those things together. She needs them as the backdrop against which her character's story makes sense. It's only against those cultural narratives that she can create the individualized voice of her character. So she talks about, she references a large portion of the population that was relieved just at the fact that combat was over, and that many people felt relieved at the signing of the armistice and at the moment of this speech. But her character is suspicious. So I just wanted to make that point, that it's only against those broad cultural narratives that her character's voice starts to become clear. So when our students write in this way, they have to reference the cultural narratives that are part of our other work with them in class. I do want to come back to a point about the classroom interaction, because it's an important one that's been brought to my attention very recently, that in terms of ideological meanings, it's not just the perspectives of the time period or the texts from that time period or the texts about that time period that are in play if we approach cultural learning in this way. The teacher calls the text propaganda. She calls the Vichy government the Vichy regime. So someone brought that nuance to my attention and said, that's the teacher speaking as a private person, and not really as an instructor or anything else. Those are potentially her own views, and of course our students come with their own perspectives as well. So it's a quite complex world of perspectives, linguistically, culturally, personally, that is coming into play here. Okay, so in summary, if we're talking about accessing and potentially shifting perspectives through language education, we need to understand the vantage points from which meaning is constructed by others and how those meanings are indexed in language and image, and I guess any other symbolic semiotic system. We need to become familiar with a new stock of stories and a range of plausible interpretations of these. The multi-perspectivalism that we were talking about a bit earlier today. We need to become aware of our own point of view and denaturalize our own familiar narratives. In interviews with students, they told me some very interesting stories about what they thought about the war before this class and how their own perspectives shifted. A further step is to engage in the active production of cultural narratives, a creative process that may transform our personal and shared perspectives. Kromsch wrote about this in 1995. She may have already been thinking about symbolic competence and some of the things that Heidi Burns talked about today. In order to teach a foreign language as oppositional practice, in order for it to be transformative, learners have to be addressed not as deficient monoglossic enunciators, maybe some of that native speaker ideal stuff that has been part of our profession, but as potentially heteroglossic narrators. My very last slide. So there are some implications for theory. We need to refine and expand the model, define a little bit better what cultural narratives are, move toward emphasizing the active production of cultural meanings a bit more, in addition to the interpretation of cultural narratives. Of course, I see interpretation as meaning making as well. There's a need for more empirical research. I've not encountered quite a bit about foreign language classrooms so that we can document the immersive potential that's there, but also uncover other models, not just this one about cultural narratives, which the MLA report does call one possible model. So of course there may be others. Finally, and I'm equally sensitive to this as Kristin is because I work with teachers in training, that increased attention in the training and professional development of foreign language teachers to help them better facilitate those meaningful shifts in perspective is definitely necessary. So thank you very much.